Hey guys, although today's video is very much centered on the HMS Daring, this advice, the information, and the concepts that we're going to discuss today are applicable to pretty much any of the smaller caliber guns in World of Warships. Anything smaller than 152, this video is going to provide useful information about, so consider sticking around even if maybe Daring isn't your cup of tea. Alright, thanks. Hey guys, welcome. Today I'd like to warn you that the video is going to be fairly technical. I will try to keep it light, but just be warned that maths are incoming. Listen, I really like the Daring. I really like the Daring on paper. In my configuration, she's got 24,000 hit points, 6 guns that reload in 2.8 seconds, decent torpedoes, acoustics that last longer than 3 minutes, 7 smoke charges, and a hull repair that heals 291 hit points per second for 10 seconds and reloads again for use in 80 seconds. But when I first got the ship, I wasn't very effective in it. I didn't like it that much. It didn't seem like the guns could pen very well. And I got the ship on February 11th of 2020. Sometime in March of 2020, the IFHE rework occurred. I've found a bunch of indications about this on the internet. I've seen a bunch of posts on the forums or on Reddit about how this changed. And I remember this going on quite a bit, but I don't remember going back and trying the Daring again after the IFHE rework. Suffice it to say that I played a few games with her without IFHE when I first got it, and it seemed like she couldn't pen anything, she couldn't hit anything, and I shelved the boat. I picked her up again recently, and I wondered, does it need IFHE now? Conventional wisdom, what you read on the internet, is a bunch of posts where people say, no, Daring doesn't need IFHE. But that's really it. I didn't see a lot of information out there that explained to me why it didn't need IFHE. And I did some more research later since I started making this video, and there is some content out there for that, but at first I couldn't find it. In today's video, we're going to deep dive into Daring's guns, the armor profile of the targets that Daring is going to face, her HE shells, her AP shells, and then look at a whole bunch of data provided by the wiki or the game client, and also collected by me through playing a bunch of games in the Daring. So let's get started. First, let's talk about the HE PenFormula that's in use in World of Warships. Basically, the way this works is there's a table on the wiki, and I'll put it up here on the screen so you guys can see it, that tells you what your pen fraction is for your ship. You take the caliber of the gun, you multiply it by this fraction, and that tells you how many millimeters of armor you can penetrate with your HE shells. Some ships have enhanced HE penetration, or what we call quarter pen. We see German quarter pen sometimes, because a lot of the German ships, cruisers, destroyers, have a more advantageous HE pen ratio. They pen 1/4 of their gun caliber instead of 1/6, which is the most common. Daring is a 1/6 ship. So in order to do the math for this ship, we would take its gun caliber, 113 millimeters, and either multiply it by 1/6 or divide it by 6. It's effectively the same. You can think of it however you prefer. And that comes out with a millimeters of armor it can pen that is 18.83 millimeters. Now, we know that 18.83 is not 19, right? 19 millimeters is kind of a magic number when it comes to armor in World of Warships. A lot of the upper tier ships, and even some of the mid and lower tier ships, have 19 millimeter armor. So if the Daring can't pen 19 millimeter armor, if it can only pen 18.83, how is it ever going to get any sort of penetrations? Well, luckily for us, the HE pen math formula has thought of this, and anything over 18.5 would round up to 19. Anything over 23.5 would round up to 24, that kind of a thing. So knowing that 19 millimeters was kind of a bare minimum number, that kind of got me thinking. I wondered if IFHE would help me pen more things, or if it would be a waste of captain points. I'll put up the IFHE formula right here, but essentially you do the HE pen formula, you take that result, and then you multiply that result by 1.25, and that should tell you the number of millimeters of armor that your IFHE equipped ship can penetrate. For Daring, what that means is we do the math for the HE penetration. We come out with 18.83 millimeters. We round that up to 19, multiply it by 1.25 to get a 25% increase, and then round that value down, as it says in the wiki, which results in 23 millimeters of pen when we've got IFHE. In order to find out if IFHE would help, I did two things. And the first was I looked at a bunch of armor profiles of ships in the game to see what might be penetrated if we went with IFHE and could now get through 23 millimeters of armor. So I'm going to take you guys with me. We're going to look at some example ships, some battleships, some cruisers, and some destroyers, and we'll take a look at that. I'm not going to bother looking at aircraft carriers because it's very rare that you're going to be shooting them. It doesn't happen in most games. So the first battleship I want to talk about is the Montana. I look at Montana as a very strong baseline of what a battleship is and what it should be. All of the other battleships, to me, or at least in my mind, are kind of variants on this particular model, if you will. The Yamato is like a Montana, but it's got huge guns, right? Or Kremlin is like a Montana, but really tanky. Or Kurfurst is a battleship, but it's got secondaries, right? Like, Montana is a battleship that's a battleship. That's its whole thing. It's maneuverable, it's got big guns, it's got decent armor, but like all ships, it has weaknesses. Let's take a look at the Montana's armor profile here and see what it's got. Now, we know that 19 millimeters is the amount of penetration that we have with Daring's HE guns base without IFHE, and that number jumps up to 23 millimeters, according to the client, when we add IFHE. So we look at the superstructure. This is 19 millimeters. This is 19 millimeters for a couple of reasons. Number one, this doesn't tend to be a very well-armored portion of the ship anyway. And number two, if it wasn't 19 millimeters, there'd be a whole bunch of ships in World of Warships that couldn't do any damage to the Montana under any circumstances. Like if this was 300 millimeters or something, there would be ships that just would have no ability to damage the Montana. Every other piece of armor that's on here is 32 millimeters, 409 millimeters, 254 millimeters, 32 millimeters. Montana can really only be damaged by the Daring in the superstructure. So let this be a lesson to you if you're in your Daring or a similar destroyer or small caliber ship. You really don't want to be shooting at the bow with your HE shells. You don't want to be shooting at the waterline. You only want to be shooting at the superstructure. This is obvious advice, but this is a really great illustration of why that's the case. This is the only part of the Montana that you can pen with the main guns, with HE at least, on the Daring. And we notice that there's nothing here that is between 19 and 23 millimeters. So doing IFHE is not going to help you fight the Montana. Let's go take a look at Kremlin, a heavily armored example of a battleship. We'll pull this up here. Kremlin, I'm going to have to preview it as it's another boat that I don't have. Kremlin is also obviously a tier 10 battleship, pulling up its armor layout. It looks very similar to Montana, at least at first glance, right? 32 millimeters up front, 430 millimeters in the middle, 410, 19 millimeter plate on the superstructure, but I'm not seeing anything here that's 22 millimeters or 23 millimeters or anything like that, right? Obviously, there's some differences between the way the Montana is configured and the way the Kremlin is configured, but nothing here tells me that, if I go get IFHE, I'll be able to pen more parts of the Kremlin. Just like with the Montana, we only want to be shooting at the superstructure with the HE shells from the Daring. And the last battleship I'm going to go look at is the Kurfurst. And believe me, there are tons of battleships to look at. And I looked at more than just these three. But I'm going to show you these two because they are fairly known for their armor. But these other battleships are very similarly constructed as well. They've got that 19 millimeter superstructure. And everything else is more heavily armored than 23 millimeters will pen. 32 millimeters, 60 millimeters, 32 millimeters, 50 millimeter deck. Here's a 19 millimeter superstructure, same thing that we had on the other two battleships. And then the gun casemates and barbettes are huge, 250 millimeters, 380 millimeters, etc. So Kurfurst is yet another ship where the Daring can only damage its superstructure, even if it goes and gets IFHE. So what did we learn from this battleship exploration? IFHE is not going to help the Daring against battleships. So next I want to take a look at some cruisers. I've chosen the Petropavlovsk, the Moines, and the Minotaur as the exemplar cruisers here to go look at. I looked at a lot more than just these three ships, but the results were basically the same across all of the ships. If you've come up with something that's more interesting, please let me know in the comments below. First, let's talk about Petropavlovsk. We'll look at its armor layout. What we're looking at here is not totally different from what we saw with the battleships, right? We've got a superstructure. In this case, it's 16 millimeters. This is pennable by the Daring's guns without IFHE, but everything else, 25 millimeters, it's too much for the 23 millimeter IFHE pen to get through. This is even more, 50 millimeters, 180 millimeter belts, 180 millimeters on the gun, 25 millimeters out back. So just like with the battleships, Petropavlovsk, which we know to be a fairly tanky, heavily armored cruiser is not gonna be penned by 23 millimeters in any places it wouldn't already be in a non-IFHE equipped daring captain's loadout. So really, the thing we're learning here is the daring needs to be shooting at the superstructure of the Petropavlovsk because it can't pen anywhere else, IFHE or no. Well, let's go grab Des Moines and see if the story's any different there. Des Moines, Des Moines. There it is. Go and preview the Des Moines. Now I own the Des Moines, but I'll still use preview because it kind of clears the screen up here. We go to armor layout again, similar looking story to what we just saw on the Petropavlovsk. 16 millimeters here on the superstructure, very pennable by non-IFHE equipped shells from the Daring. And then 27 millimeter, it's actually more heavily armored than Petro. 27 millimeter here, 30 millimeter, 152. Nothing that we can pen with IFHE that we couldn't already pen without it. So Des Moines, same situation. I won't go grab the Minotaur. Now, the Minotaur is a light cruiser, whereas both of those were heavy cruisers. It's important to remember that when we talk about light and heavy cruisers in World of Warships, we are not talking about armor, we're talking about gun caliber. Although often, some heavier ships will come with additional armor. That is not the case all the time. We take a look at the Minotaur here, we'll go to the preview mode. And we'll open up its armor layout. Now, Minotaur is a very different ship than both Des Moines and Petropavlovsk. Minotaur is a light cruiser, and it comes with light armor to match. Small guns, of course, is what makes it a light cruiser. Let's take a look at these armor plates. 16 millimeters, 16 millimeters, 16 millimeters, 101 millimeters, 16 millimeters, 13 millimeters on the superstructure, 51, 51, 102, etc. So everything that we could pen here, we can pen with the 19 millimeter pen of the non-IFHE Daring guns, and nothing here is between 19 and 23 millimeters, which is what we would really be looking for if we're trying to find something that IFHE can help us with. So in this case, IFHE doesn't help us with the Minotaur, the Des Moines, or the Petropavlovsk. So next, let's take a look at a few destroyers. I've chosen Shimakaze, Halland, and the new German destroyer Elbing as the exemplary ships to check out destroyer armor layouts. I looked at a lot more than this, just like I did with cruisers and battleships, but these three I think are all three kind of interesting ships because they bring different things to the table. So the Shimakaze's armor layout is, as you would expect, rather light. Destroyers do not come with heavy armor, and the Shimakaze is certainly no exception to that rule. The main parts of its hull are 19 millimeters. Pretty much everywhere on the ship is 19 millimeters, even the deck. It does have some lighter armored sections here, 13 millimeters on some superstructure portions, and the guns here are 20 mil on the side, top, and front. So that is what we're seeing here on the Shimakaze. Everything except for the guns is fully pennable. Oh, and this little conning tower is fully pennable by the Daring without any IFHE assistance. You should be able to gun down a Shimakaze, or at least shoot up a Shimakaze, without any need for the IFHE captain perk. If we wander over and take a look at the Halland, we'll find that on our Pan-Euro destroyer tech tree. Just unlocked this ship. I'm actually pretty stoked about it. Here is Halland. Let's recall the commander. So Andrzej Wojna is there. The Halland here, again, similar armor layout to what we had on the Shimakaze. It's very lightly armored, 19 mil for most of the hull, if not all of the hull, and then lightly armored superstructure of 13 millimeters. The guns here are 6 mil, which actually is kind of interesting. That means you can probably knock these guns out fairly easily if you're a good enough shot to hit them. So again, everything on the Halland is very much pennable by the Daring without IFHE. We don't need IFHE to pen the Daring. Let's grab Elbing and see what we can learn about that ship. We go to the German tech tree. Now Elbing, again, being the new tier 10. I'm obviously not there yet, but we are cruising for it. Here is Elbing. If we grab its armor layout and take a look at this. Now this is a slightly different story. First of all, Elbing is enormous, right? And people are running around with a 35,000 hit point Elbing because they've got the extra hit points for their commander perk on there. So this is a huge ship. It's very large, and it is not really a traditional destroyer in the same way. In fact, it's got a 19 millimeter bow, which means you can pen the bow. It's got 19 mil on the back, on the aft end, so you can pen the aft. But you cannot pen the side plating without switching shell types. HE for the Daring will not pen the side plating. And it's 25 millimeters, not 23, 22, 21, or 20, which means that IFHE is not going to help you pen the side plating on the Elbing either. The Superstructure is 13 millimeters, and the guns are actually very well armored for a destroyer, 40 mil on the side, 35 on the top, and 100 millimeters on the front. So when we look at the Elbing, this is a ship that's going to be hard to pen, other than shooting at the fore and aft ends and the superstructure. The Daring, IFHE, not going to help you with the Elbing. You probably want to consider AP shells, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Daring's AP later on in this video. Remember how earlier I said I did 2 things to try to figure this problem out? My initial research was the first thing. I went and I looked at all the armor profiles of those ships to see if I thought 23 millimeters of pen from IFHE would help. And it seemed like no. The answer is no, it wouldn't help. I always like, of course, to have a good data set to back up those assumptions and to verify the information that we read. I was pretty confident that it wouldn't matter, but the second thing I did was I went out and collected a bunch of data to prove those early assumptions from the initial research correct or false. I ran 10 games in the Daring with IFHE, and I ran 10 games in the Daring without IFHE. For each game, I tracked a whole bunch of data, and I will show all of this raw data at the end of the video if anybody wants to double check my math or maybe try this experiment themselves or anything like that. I'm guessing that most people will probably not bother to crack out the old spreadsheets and go ham, but I'll share what I learned. I tracked things like HE hits, pens versus shatters, the percentage of hits that led to fires, and calculated things like the average damage per hit and average damage per pen. I tracked a total of over 1,800 HE gun hits, and we'll talk about how many here, between those 20 games. And then I actually ended up playing a bunch of games and tracking some armor-piercing hits as well, and we'll talk about those when the time is right. I want to be upfront with the fact that there are flaws and assumptions baked into this method. First of all, 10 battles isn't very many. More data is always more definitive. So if I could have done this over 100 battles or 1,000 battles, obviously we would have reached a more averaged out equilibrium on all of these figures I'm about to share with you, and they'd probably be more accurate. We're also limited by my ability and skills in the Daring, right? A player who's more accurate than me at hitting the right part of the ship with the right kind of shell is going to achieve better numbers, higher pen percentages, and more damage per shot than I did. And a player who's worse than me would do worse. I assume this impact is negligible since all of the battles that I'm comparing are just being compared against each other, and they were all played by me, a player whose skill basically did not vary that much while I played those battles. The enemies I was up against were also random, right? I wasn't in control of what ships I was shooting at in each particular battle. So that could result in having a match full of really heavily armored targets where my pen percentage would be lower than average, or a battle of really lightly armored targets where my pen percentage would be artificially high. I'm hoping that across the 900 plus battles we did with IFHE, or excuse me, 900 plus hits we did with IFHE, or 900 plus hits we did without, that's averaged out. But again, more data would make that more averaged. Long story short, there's a million reasons why this is not a 100% scientific study, but you can kind of think of it as a survey of 1,859 individual HE hits made by the Daring on various targets, some with IFHE, some without IFHE, and I'll share the results with you. Like I said, if you're interested in taking this experiment to the next step, I wish you luck. Let's talk briefly about Daring's AP shells. So in one battle, I encountered another Daring captain who was exclusively shooting AP at me and my allies. That kind of got me thinking, does this player know something that I don't? Well, of course, it turned out that he did. And so I went and researched Daring's AP shells and discovered some new stuff. Daring has enhanced AP angles. In fact, it has the same angles that we have with US cruisers like Moines that everyone's always so enamored by. As a result of finding out this information kind of late in the data collection, I went out and I played 5 more battles with armor-piercing shells only, plus torpedoes, in the Daring, and I came back with some interesting information. So I'll include that as we kind of go over the results down below, and hopefully that makes sense and it's kind of interesting. Let's go. Let's go! Well, let's talk about the overall data. With IFHE, we collected information about 927 gun hits. Without IFHE, 932. I'm nothing if not consistent. Both of those were across 10 games. They're within 5 hits of each other. I thought that was kind of interesting. When I went out with armor-piercing shells, we collected information on 541 AP hits. That's a total of 1,859 HE hits that did 487,000 damage, excluding fires, across all 20 games where I ran HE. The AP hits, if you add those into the mix, we've got 2,400 Daring gun hits exactly in the survey. And across all of the games, I scored exactly 40 fires cumulatively. So let's start off by getting the first one right out of the way. Did we get more penetrations with IFHE? Is the pen percentage higher with IFHE? No, I absolutely did not get more pens with IFHE. With IFHE, we scored 58% pens, and without, 60% pens. Those numbers are so close together, and the data set is small enough that I'm going to say those numbers are as near as makes no difference, identical. With armor-piercing shells, we scored 42.14% pens. Another metric that I calculated is what I'm calling effective damage per hit. This is basically taking all of the HE damage that you did with either IFHE or non-IFHE fired shells, excluding fires, and dividing that by the total number of hits that you scored, including all of the non-penetrations. So effective damage per hit kind of illustrates the amount of damage that you can expect to get every time one of your shells lands on an enemy ship. Sometimes you're going to get 0 damage because the shell's going to shatter or whatever, and sometimes you're going to hit maximum HE, 1700 hit points or what have you. But this basically is kind of an averaging, an effective average of all of those numbers. With IFHE, we scored 253.5 hit points, and without IFHE, 270.7. Armor-piercing shells did 236.7. But it's kind of interesting to think that when I was running APs and only APs, I was never allowing myself to switch to HEs in order to shoot an HE shell when I felt like the pen angles weren't going to be favorable. So that number is probably a little artificially low. I'm going to assume that the IFHE and non-IFHE numbers are basically within spitting distance of each other, and that's the same. I don't believe the damage is going to change whether or not you're using IFHE. It's just whether or not you're going to get that pen based on the armor thickness. And as we just discovered with the previous metric, that armor thickness penetration benefit isn't real for IFHE for the daring. So I'm going to say that 250 to 270 is about what you can expect to get with every hit you're going to shoot with the daring. And 236 with the AP, I bet you is a little bit low because I took some suboptimal AP shots when I would have rather switched to HE, but for the experiment, I didn't allow myself to do that. The next value I calculated, I'm calling effective fire chance, right? This is basically calculated by taking the total number of hits and dividing that by the total number of fires that were started for either IFHE or for non-IFHE configurations. Now, Daring has a fire chance of 8.5% on her HE shells, and we know that many factors can affect this number, so you're not always going to get 8.5%, right? So with IFHE, the effective fire chance was 1.83%. Without IFHE, my effective fire chance was 2.47%. I have an average of about 93 hits per game across all of the games that I played. And so if these percentages hold, I can expect that with IFHE, I'll get about 1.7 fires per game. And without IFHE, you'll get 2.3 fires per game. Obviously, if you get more hits than me, you'll get more fires. If you get less hits than me, you'll probably get less fires. Across all of the games, I scored a total of 40 fires and did 130,629 fire damage. The average damage of all of these fires was 3,266 damage. Now, there's a ton of factors that can affect how much damage a fire gives, how quickly the enemy ship hits repair, what kind of ship it is, like those Russian battleships can hit damage control party every 30 seconds. There's a lot of factors here, but assuming that every fire nets about 3,266 damage, and I admit that's a big assumption, with 0.6 more fires per match without IFHE, I can expect to get another 1,960 damage per match from fires if I'm not running IFHE. Obviously, like I said, there's a lot of factors here, but I think you understand the point that I'm trying to make, is that there's an amount of damage that we can expect to get from these fires. All right, so the last figure I want to talk to you about is effective damage per pen. This number is just like effective damage per hit, except for we're getting rid of anything that's considered a non-penetration and doing that math again. So with our IFHE, we saw an effective damage per pen of 437.7 hit points. Without IFHE, 450.6, and armor-piercing shells actually went all the way up to 561.7, which is a significant increase over the HE shells. Now, that might sound interesting, but when you remember that Daring's HE shells have a max damage of 1700 and Daring's AP shells have a max damage of 2100, we know that the HE shells have a max that is 80% of that of their armor piercing, and that's effectively what we're seeing here. If we average all of the HE shells across IFHE and non-IFHE for their pens, because they're all pretty much the same there, and compare that against the AP average that I experienced, our HE is doing about 80% of the damage of our AP. So no surprise with that number. I think a player who's accurate and can learn to use that AP well is going to be benefited by using armor-piercing shells when the situation is calling for it. Okay, so what did we learn today? I think we definitely learned that you do not need IFHE on the Daring. Not only did the documentation and our research show this, but we did an experiment and it turns out to be true in practice. There's no reason to run IFHE on the Daring. Don't do it, save those points, and buy something more effective for your captain. Daring has awesome AP angles. I learned this today. Maybe you guys already knew, and if so, pat yourselves on the back for being super smart and tell a friend. People should know about these cool AP angles, and we should be out there using AP in our Darings. Lastly, we also learned that if you're a good shot and can utilize those AP angles well, you should switch to AP to tear up heavier DDs, cruisers, battleship superstructures, and anything else you can get your APs on to really maximize your damage. You'll do about 20% more damage per penetration. Now, I want to thank you guys for watching today's video. I am going to show you my captain configuration right now. Do one of those things where I pretend to look up, but I'll do it. We'll show you my captain configuration. I'll show you what I do for upgrades, and then I will also put up the spec sheets and the data for the IFHE and non-IFHE experiment and AP as well. In the links in the description below, we've got some links that will take you to Wargaming's pages about penetration armor thresholds, as well as a forum post by Little White Mouse that explains more about IFHE after the IFHE rework. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. Please take care of each other, and we'll see you out there in the next battle. So the first battleship I wanted to talk about was the